In the countryside, men still represent the stronger gender group. Women, on the other hand, are socially and economically more vulnerable. When policies are enforced, various gender disparities come to shape legal realities on the ground. In divorce lawsuits, women often walk away without any judicial remedies for domestic violence. Mothers often end up losing child custody, and there's a pretty good chance that women on the verge of divorce end up giving up their property rights.
What is a key takeaway from your research on marriage in China?
Despite repeated emphasis on gender inequality on the books, in reality, there's still tremendous gender inequality, both within and outside Chinese courts. And people sometimes expect courts to equalize men and women in society. And yet, what I learned from this project is courts, legal professions often end up doing the opposite. Instead of alleviating gender inequality in Chinese family, in society at large, courts and legal professions often end up reproducing and reinforcing power differentials and inequalities in Chinese society. So I think that's the biggest takeaway.
What do gender disparities in China's legal system look like?
If we just focus on law on the books or policies on the books, we may walk away with the impression that Chinese laws are either gender neutral, or you may even have the impression that policymakers, lawmakers have tried really hard to protect women's rights and welfare. Well, then in reality, when these laws are implemented or when policies are enforced, various gender disparities come to shape realities, legal realities on the ground. And perhaps one good example is that according to the marriage law and now the civil code, both men and women shall be equal in marriage, right? But in reality, especially when you look at court rulings in divorce lawsuits, women often walk away from divorce lawsuits without any judicial remedies for domestic violence. Mothers often end up losing child custody. And if the couple in question have joint property, there's a pretty good chance that women on the verge of divorce end up giving up their property rights. So this is where I see a huge gap between law on the books and law in action.
What is the process for getting a divorce for rural women in China?
Most of the women in my book were migrant women. So these were women hailing from the countryside and working in China's metropolitan areas for a living. And for these women, if they wanted a divorce, many first had to accumulate cash so they could fund their divorce lawsuits. So almost the very first step was to find a job, a farm job in Chinese cities, towns, and save money first, and then find a helper, usually a legal professional, a lawyer or maybe a basic level legal worker, to get a sense of how to launch a divorce lawsuit against one spouse. So that was the second step, find a legal professional. And the third step is travel all the way back to countryside. Because remember, a lot of the women work in the cities and they couldn't really go anywhere to file divorce lawsuits. They would have to go back to where their hukou were located and find a local court, file a divorce lawsuit. That's the next step. And once a court agreed to hear your case, you would have to wait until a judge could locate the whereabouts of your husband, bring two individuals into a court organized mediation or maybe adjudication. And this process could last anywhere between a few weeks or a few months, in some cases, even years, depending on what could happen along the way. So it can be very time-consuming and costly. And of course, while women wait for the court system to reach a decision, a lot of them couldn't really continue their employment, right? And so this means that during that time period, they would have no income. Most of them relied on their savings for this time period. In the countryside, men still represent the stronger gender group. Women, on the other hand, are socially and economically more vulnerable than men, and in their own communities, women were usually treated as outsiders. So it was much harder for women to mobilize local communities to support their legal mobilization. So if you happen to be a victim of domestic violence, for example, it would be really hard to find a neighbor or a community leader or village cadre to testify on your behalf and prove that you did suffer from domestic violence, or maybe your husband was cheating on you. So it was much harder for women to mobilize local communities. And finally, for the local court system, judges were quite aware a lot of these rural men, once they became divorced, it would be really hard for them to find another spouse. And this in part had a lot to do with China's highly skewed sex ratio. There were just not enough marriageable women to go around. So once these husbands sever their ties with wives, it's very likely that they would remain single for the rest of their life. And judges were acutely aware of these social demographic problems. And if a man threatens to harm himself or to hurt his wife, suddenly this could become a matter of weighing. The translation is usually stability maintenance. So judges sometimes, in order to pacify these men, they sacrifice women's property rights, custodial rights, and spousal rights in exchange for husbands' cooperation in divorce lawsuits.
How does gender equality differ in rural versus urban areas in China?
There are definitely important differences between urban and rural China. As I mentioned earlier, in the countryside, women, once they get married, they often relocate from their natal villages, natal families, to live with their husband and their in-law. They also need to change their hukou status. Natal village or natal family refers to the family, the village you were born into. The family or the village they are married into, these are conjugal family or conjugal villages. In their conjugal villages, these women are often viewed as outsiders, and that outsider status makes a much difference when you try to mobilize state law, the local court, to contest your rights. But in urban China, women don't necessarily have to relocate and join their conjugal family or conjugal village. So that's just one structural factor that can put rural women in very disadvantaged positions in litigation.
What does non-governmental assistance for rural women seeking legal help to get a divorce look like in China?
There was a noticeable absence of NGOs, civil society groups advocating for rural women. For 15 years or so, I could name one and only one organization. Initially, it was an NGO, and later it became the law firm. That was the only organization that dedicated its time, energy to help migrant women. And of course, if we're here to talk about college-educated, professional women getting together to form collective action, that's very different. So I just want to quickly separate these two scenarios. But if we're just here to talk about millions of migrant workers in China, especially migrant women, if they want to contest their rights, if they want to protect their rights as mothers, wives, and property owners, it it would be really, really difficult for these women to find NGOs to help them. So I'm afraid till this day, this is still the case.